The contradictory life and timeless wisdom of Seneca the Younger. On a warm spring evening in 65 CE, Rome's most powerful philosopher drew his last breath. As blood flowed from his opened veins and poison coursed through his body, Seneca the Younger dictated his final thoughts to attending scribes, turning even his forced suicide into a lesson for posterity. It was a fitting end for a man who had lived a life of spectacular contradictions, a multi-millionaire who preached simplicity, a political kingmaker who championed inner freedom, and the brilliant mind who shaped an emperor only to be destroyed by his own creation. This is the story of the aristocrat who taught generations how to die, the exile who counseled contentment, and the power broker who penned history's most penetrating guide to the quiet life. From the sun-baked streets of ancient Cordoba to the marbled halls of Imperial Rome, Seneca's journey would intersect with the most fascinating figures of his age, emperors and conspirators, philosophers and paramours, as he rose to become the most influential voice of his generation. But more than a tale of ancient Rome, this is an exploration of timeless questions. How should power be wielded? Can wisdom and politics mix? And most crucially, how does one live a good life in a world gone mad? The Rise of Seneca, a journey between worlds. The scent of olive groves and dusty limestone hung in the air of Cordoba as young Lucius Annius Seneca first learned to form words in 3 languages. His father, a wealthy member of the equestrian order who had built his fortune through shrewd land deals, insisted on Greek from the nurses, Latin from the tutors, and the local Hispanian dialect from the streets. It was 4 BCE, and Cordoba stood as Rome's jewel in southern Hispania, a place where colonial ambition met ancient Iberian pride, where merchants' shouts mingled with philosophers' debates, and where a young boy's mind could expand as rapidly as the empire itself. Little Lucius, pale and often sickly, found his strength not in the wrestling grounds but in the family library. While other boys trained with wooden swords, he devoured scrolls of Chrysippus and Zeno, the great Stoic masters whose words would one day pale in comparison to his own. His father, Seneca the Elder, had already made a name for himself in Rome as a master of rhetoric, compiling a vast collection of legal speeches and argumentative techniques that would become required reading for aspiring orators. But he saw in his second son something beyond mere talent for persuasion, a fire for ideas that burned brighter than the Andalusian sun. The boy's first test came early, when racking asthma threatened to end his studies. Unable to run with other children and often confined to bed, young Seneca turned his illness into opportunity. He began to practice what would later become his trademark, the ability to transform personal suffering into universal wisdom. Between fits of coughing, he memorized poetic verses. During sleepless nights, he composed his first philosophical thoughts. His aunt, seeing his struggle, took him under her wing. A formidable woman who had married into the governorship of Egypt, she arranged for his first journey to Rome, a decision that would alter not just one life, but the course of Western thought. In 14 CE, the same year that Augustus, Rome's first emperor, breathed his last, teenage Seneca boarded a ship bound for the capital. He carried with him a head full of philosophy, a poet's tongue, and the burning ambition of a provincial determined to conquer Rome not with a sword, but with ideas. His father had taught him that power flows to those who can persuade. His illness had taught him that the body's weaknesses need not chain the mind, and Cordoba had taught him that true wisdom knows no borders. As the coastline of Hispania faded into the Mediterranean mist, young Seneca could not have known that he was embarking on a journey that would lead him to the heights of power and the depths of exile, to unprecedented wealth and forced suicide, to the ears of emperors and the hearts of generations. Behind him lay the olive groves of childhood, ahead loomed the 7 hills of destiny. Rome awaited its most eloquent adopted son, and Seneca, boy philosopher, ambitious provincial, future kingmaker, was ready to answer its call. The making of a Stoic, Seneca's journey through philosophy and power. Rome in 14 CE struck visitors like a fever dream. The city's 1 million inhabitants cramped together in towering insulae, their daily dramas playing out in streets that reeked of fish sauce and ambition. Into this maelstrom stepped young Seneca, his provincial clothes marking him as surely as his accent. But while other newcomers gawked at the marble temples, he headed straight for the heart of Roman intellectual life, the house of Socian, where philosophy was served fresh each morning with honeyed wine and sharp debate. Socion belonged to the Pythagorean school, and his first command to his new students struck at the core of Roman identity: abandon meat. In a culture where sacrificial feasts marked every significant occasion, vegetarianism wasn't just a dietary choice, it was a rebellion. Seneca embraced it with characteristic intensity until his father, worried about political whispers connecting meat abstainers with foreign cults, convinced him to return to conventional Roman dining. It would be his first lesson in balancing philosophical conviction with political survival. But it was Attalus who truly ignited Seneca's passion for Stoicism. Unlike other philosophers who lectured from comfortable distances about theoretical virtues, Attalus lived his teachings. He slept on bare boards, rejected fine clothes, and challenged his students to do the same. "Philosophy," he thundered, "is not a gentle art meant for public display. It is a forge for the soul." Under his guidance, Seneca began the practice of voluntary hardship, bathing in cold water, eating plain food, and occasionally sleeping on the floor of his family's luxurious villa, much to the amusement of their slaves. These philosophical experiments might have remained mere youthful enthusiasms, if not for the political earthquake that rocked Rome in 31 CE. Sejanus, the mighty prefect who had effectively ruled alongside Emperor Tiberius, fell from power in a single day. The subsequent purge of his allies demonstrated a truth that would shape Seneca's philosophy. No power was permanent, no position secure. While others drew the lesson that one should avoid politics entirely, Seneca reached a different conclusion. True security lay not in external circumstances, but in the cultivation of inner strength. His entry into Rome's legal courts proved this philosophy's worth. Defending clients before the centumviral court, Seneca developed his signature style, a blend of razor-sharp logic and emotional resonance that left listeners spellbound. Word of his talents reached the Imperial palace, and soon he found himself advising senators and knights who sought not just legal counsel but philosophical guidance. His private philosophical writings began circulating among Rome's elite, passed hand to hand like secrets too precious to entrust to booksellers. Yet success brought danger. His eloquence caught the jealous attention of Caligula, Rome's new emperor, who dismissed Seneca's oratory as mere sand without lime, but nonetheless considered executing him out of envy. The young philosopher survived only because a courtier convinced Caligula that Seneca's persistent cough meant he would die soon anyway. The incident taught him another crucial lesson. In Rome, talent without political skill was merely an invitation to destruction. As the decade drew to a close, Seneca had transformed from a provincial intellectual into someone far more dangerous. A philosopher who understood power, a Stoic who knew how to speak to wealth, and a man rapidly becoming too prominent to ignore. His teachings about fate, fortune, and the true nature of happiness found eager audiences among Rome's upper classes, who sensed that their world stood on the brink of convulsive change. They were right, but none of them, not even Seneca himself, could have predicted how dramatically his philosophical principles would soon be tested. Exile and redemption, Seneca's journey from ruin to power. The charge was adultery with Julia Livilla, youngest sister of Emperor Caligula. Whether true or merely convenient, it hardly mattered. Seneca found himself standing before the Senate in 41 CE, his carefully constructed world crumbling. Claudius, the new emperor, had political debts to pay, and Seneca's destruction would settle several accounts at once. The sentence came swiftly: exile to Corsica, a wind-battered rock far from Rome's intrigues. Corsica's stark landscape matched Seneca's stripped fortunes. Gone were the marble halls and philosophical debates, replaced by a rustic cottage and the ceaseless Mediterranean winds. Here, among the island's rough inhabitants who cared nothing for Stoic paradoxes or rhetorical flourishes, Seneca faced his own teachings in their rawest form. His letters from this period reveal a man wrestling with his principles. "It is not I who am condemned to Corsica," he wrote, "but Corsica which is condemned to contain me." The exile proved fertile ground for his genius. In his crude dwelling, with only the stars for company, he wrote some of his most penetrating works. On the shortness of life emerged from these years, a meditation on time and mortality that would echo through centuries. He mapped the heavens, studied natural phenomena, and composed tragic plays that would later set Roman theaters ablaze. Yet beneath the philosophical facade, his letters betrayed a man desperate to return to the center of power, alternating between dignified acceptance and barely concealed pleading. Redemption arrived wearing imperial purple. Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's new wife and one of Rome's most formidable women, needed a tutor for her son, the future Emperor Nero. She also needed allies who owed their loyalty to her alone. Seneca, with his brilliant mind and 8 years of enforced contemplation, fit both requirements perfectly. In 49 CE, an imperial messenger arrived at his Corsican door with a recall to Rome. His return to the capital resembled a triumph. The same senators who had voted for his exile now scrambled to pay their respects. Agrippina elevated him to the praetorship, and suddenly the exile became kingmaker, tasked with molding a 12-year-old boy into Rome's future ruler. Seneca approached his task with the full weight of his philosophical training and hard-won political wisdom. He designed an educational program combining practical governance with moral philosophy, hoping to create the enlightened ruler that Plato had only dreamed of. In private moments, as he walked through his restored gardens or dined with Rome's elite, Seneca must have marveled at fate's sharp turns. He had lost everything and regained more than he had started with. But there was a price for this restoration, one that would haunt his later writings. He had learned that pure philosophy must sometimes bow to power's necessities, that survival required compromise, and that the path between principle and pragmatism was vanishingly narrow. As he shaped young Nero's mind, Seneca stood at the apex of Roman society, his influence extending far beyond the palace walls. Yet he never forgot the wind-swept cottage on Corsica. His most powerful teachings from this period speak to the impermanence of fortune, both good and bad. "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end," he wrote, not knowing that his own story was about to take its most dramatic turn yet as his young pupil moved ever closer to the throne of the world. Philosophy and Power: The Rise and Fall of Seneca. Dawn broke over Rome on October 13th, 54 CE, and with it came the news: Claudius was dead. As the city erupted in carefully choreographed grief, Seneca sat in his study, putting the final touches on a speech that would shape an empire. Hours later, 16-year-old Nero strode into the Senate and delivered his tutor's words with practiced precision. The promises of clemency, liberty, and justice flowed like honey, each phrase crafted to soothe the fears of Rome's power brokers. By sunset, the Senate had declared Nero divine, and Seneca had become the most powerful man in the known world. The partnership between philosopher and prince reshaped the empire. Seneca and his ally Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, managed the vast machinery of state while Nero indulged his artistic pursuits. Their administration marked a golden age of competent governance. Taxes were reduced, diplomacy replaced force, and provincial governors found themselves actually prosecuted for corruption. Seneca's personal fortune swelled to 300 million sesterces, a sum so vast it rivaled the imperial treasury. He owned villas across Italy, vast estates in Egypt, and a fleet of merchant ships that plied the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this glittering surface, tensions simmered. Agrippina, furious at being slowly sidelined from power, battled constantly with her son. Nero's artistic pretensions, his insistence on performing in public, his late-night wanderings through Rome's taverns, threatened the dignity of his office. Seneca found himself writing ever more elaborate speeches justifying his pupils' eccentricities to the Senate, each one a masterpiece of rhetorical misdirection. The breaking point came in 59 CE. Nero, tired of his mother's interference, demanded her death. For 5 days, Seneca and Burrus desperately tried to dissuade him. When Nero remained adamant, they faced the ultimate philosophical dilemma: resign in protest and likely die, or remain and become accomplices. They chose survival. Seneca's pen crafted the letter to the Senate justifying Agrippina's murder, transforming matricide into an act of state necessity. That night, it was said, he wrote in his private journal, "Philosophy teaches us to act, not to speak." In the aftermath, Nero's reign darkened. The emperor, freed from his last familial constraint, indulged his worst impulses. Seneca responded by withdrawing gradually from public life, citing poor health and a desire for philosophical study. His writing from this period crackles with barely disguised criticism of tyranny, yet always phrased with plausible deniability. On Benefits and On Clemency emerged as masterworks of political philosophy and veiled warnings to his former pupil. Yet even as he retreated to his gardens, Seneca's wealth made him a target. 3 times he offered his entire fortune to Nero. 3 times the emperor refused with increasingly cold assurances of friendship. Rome's greatest Stoic found himself trapped in a gilded cage, watching his pupil transform into everything he had spent a lifetime writing against. His last major work from this period, On the Happy Life, reads less like a philosophical treatise and more like a man trying to convince himself that his compromises had been worth it. By 62 CE, when Burrus died under suspicious circumstances, Seneca knew his time was running out. He had reached the pinnacle of power only to find it was a prison. His teachings about fortune's fickleness, written in exile, now proved prophetic in ways he had never imagined. As he looked out over Rome from his palace on the Caelian hill, he must have wondered if he had tried to achieve the impossible, to bring philosophy into the heart of power without being corrupted by it. The philosopher's final test: Seneca's journey through power, wisdom, and mortality. The Rome of 62 CE gleamed with Nero's excesses. A vast golden palace rose from the heart of the city, its halls echoing with increasingly bizarre entertainments. Ships rained rose petals onto dining guests, and senators fought as gladiators while their emperor sang. In his villa on the outskirts of the city, Seneca watched it all unravel, writing frantically as if racing against time to preserve his life's wisdom. His lifestyle changed dramatically. Gone were the jeweled cups and young slaves. In their place came simple meals and long walks through his gardens. He tested himself with voluntary poverty, sleeping on hard boards and eating plain bread, not from fear of what was coming, he told friends, but to be ready for it. His newest works, Natural Questions and Letters to Lucilius, poured forth, each one more urgent than the last, filled with insights that read like a man settling his philosophical accounts. The fire that consumed Rome in 64 CE marked the point of no return. As flames devoured entire districts, rumors swirled that Nero had orchestrated the disaster to clear space for his architectural ambitions. Seneca, perhaps sensing the growing instability of the regime, offered again to surrender his wealth and retire. Nero's refusal came with a chilling reminder that no one left his inner circle alive. In these final months, Seneca's writings turned to death, not with fear, but with a clear-eyed examination that would later inspire philosophers and martyrs alike. "Life is like a play," he wrote to Lucilius. "It matters not how long the act is, but how well it is played." He began distributing his wealth secretly to trusted friends, prepared poison in his chambers, and waited for the inevitable. It came in the form of the Pisonian conspiracy. A group of senators and military officers, desperate to end Nero's reign, approached various nobles about replacing the emperor. Whether Seneca actually joined the plot remains debated, but in Nero's paranoid mind, mere association was enough. The emperor's messenger arrived during dinner, bearing orders for immediate suicide. Seneca received the news with philosophical calm that stunned even his enemies. He embraced his weeping wife Paulina and dictated his final thoughts to waiting scribes. When the first poison proved too slow, he entered a steam bath to speed its effects. As his life ebbed away, he ordered his servants to take down his last words. "I leave you what I have most valuable, the image of my life." The final hours stretched painfully. The poison, perhaps weakened by his austere diet, worked too slowly. His wife, attempting to die with him, was forcibly rescued by Nero's soldiers. Seneca, now barely able to speak, asked to be carried to another room so she wouldn't have to witness his end. There, he called for hemlock, and when that too proved insufficient, he stepped into a hot bath, sprinkling water on the slaves nearest him, saying these were his libations to Jupiter the Liberator. His death transformed him. The man who had struggled to reconcile power and philosophy, wealth and wisdom, ambition and virtue, achieved in his final moments the pure philosophical death he had spent decades writing about. Future generations would debate his compromises, but none could fault his end. As news of his death spread through Rome's streets, his philosophical works were already being copied and hidden away, preserved by those who understood that his real legacy lay not in his political career, but in his relentless quest to understand how to live and die well. The fall of Seneca and the collapse of Nero's reign. In the weeks following Seneca's death, Rome held its breath. The Pisonian conspirators' executions turned the city into a theater of cruelty, each day bringing new denunciations, fresh arrests, public suicides. Nero's paranoia escalated to heights that made even his staunchest supporters nervous. The emperor, now 28, had fully emerged from behind the philosophical facade his tutor had crafted for him. The confiscation of Seneca's estate revealed the true scope of his influence. Hidden in villas across Italy, scribes discovered hundreds of private letters and unpublished manuscripts, philosophical dialogues that would reshape Western thought for millennia. Nero's agents seized the obvious treasures: the Spanish silver mines, the Egyptian grain shipments, the vast real estate holdings. But they missed the real wealth: copies of Seneca's final works, already spreading through the empire's intellectual underground. Among the discovered papers was a sealed document that sent shockwaves through Rome's elite, a detailed account of the imperial court's inner workings composed during Seneca's last years. This manuscript, too dangerous to preserve, was immediately burned by Nero's orders. Yet fragments survived in whispered quotes, each one a poisoned arrow aimed at the emperor's legitimacy. Nero's subsequent fury suggested that his former teacher had written a devastating epitaph for his reign. The investigation into the conspiracy revealed an intricate web of relationships centered on Seneca. Military officers, provincial governors, and influential senators had all sought his counsel in private meetings. Each interrogation added to Nero's conviction that his old mentor had been the conspiracy's intellectual architect, carefully cultivating allies for years while maintaining a facade of retirement. The emperor's rage found expression in an empire-wide hunt for philosophical sedition, a purge that drove many of Rome's leading intellectuals into exile. Particularly galling to Nero was the public's reaction to Seneca's death. While the emperor staged increasingly elaborate entertainments, common citizens left offerings at makeshift shrines to the philosopher. Soldiers quoted his works on courage. Students in Athens and Alexandria debated his ideas about tyranny. The very qualities Nero had once mocked, Seneca's philosophical devotion, his literary style, his concern with moral questions, now emerged as powerful weapons against the regime. The emperor's response was to commission an official history condemning his former teacher as a hypocrite who preached poverty while amassing wealth and advocated virtue while enabling vice. Yet even this backfired. Each attack only increased public fascination with Seneca's writings. Underground copying houses worked through the night, producing collections of his letters and essays. His tragic plays, with their themes of power's corruption, found eager audiences in provincial theaters. As Rome descended into chaos, Seneca's prophecies about tyranny's inevitable end seemed to fulfill themselves. The Great Fire, the conspiracies, the purges, all had been foreshadowed in his philosophical works. His final letters, smuggled out by loyal followers, read like dispatches from a future that was now becoming reality. When Nero fled Rome in 68 CE, abandoned by his guards and cursed by the people, he complained that even in death, his old teacher had somehow orchestrated his fall. The Stoic philosopher's influence outlived not just Nero, but the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty. As Rome erupted in civil war, soldiers and senators alike carried copies of Seneca's essays on courage and fortitude. His death, rather than ending his influence, had transformed him from a controversial courtier into something far more powerful, a martyr for truth, whose words would inspire rebels and reformers for generations to come. Legacy of Seneca, the practical philosopher. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE sent refugees streaming east with whatever treasures they could carry. Among the most precious cargo were hand-copied manuscripts of Seneca's works, preserved by an unlikely alliance of pagan philosophers and Christian monks. While marble temples crumbled and bronze statues were melted for weapons, Seneca's words found sanctuary in Byzantine libraries and Arabic translations, waiting for a renaissance that would transform them into intellectual dynamite. That explosion came in 1345, when Petrarch discovered a cache of Seneca's letters in a dusty monastery archive. Like a philosophical time capsule, these writings spoke directly to the emerging humanist movement. Here was a voice from antiquity that dealt not in abstract theories but in practical wisdom: how to face death, handle grief, resist tyranny, and find happiness in an uncertain world. The letters spread like wildfire through Renaissance Europe, influencing thinkers from Montaigne to Shakespeare, who borrowed not just Seneca's ideas, but entire passages for his plays. Calvin quoted him. Erasmus edited him. Queen Elizabeth, I translated him. In the age of absolute monarchs, Seneca's plays about power's corruption became required reading in Europe's underground resistance movements. His essays on natural philosophy influenced early scientists, while his letters on ethics helped shape Enlightenment thought. During the French Revolution, Robespierre carried a copy of Seneca's works in his pocket, though he notably ignored the philosopher's teachings on clemency. The Industrial Age brought new relevance to Seneca's teachings about the relationship between wealth and wisdom. Industrialists read his essays on using riches wisely, while labor organizers found ammunition in his critiques of luxury. His psychological insights into anxiety, anger, and resilience attracted attention from early psychiatrists. Friedrich Nietzsche declared him the toreador of virtue, admiring how Seneca could make philosophy dance in the arena of real life. Modern discoveries have only heightened Seneca's relevance. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective modern psychological treatments, traces its intellectual ancestry to Stoic practices. Seneca described 2,000 years ago. His writings on time management could have been written for today's overwhelmed executives. His thoughts on handling information overload seem eerily prescient in our digital age. Yet perhaps Seneca's greatest legacy lies not in any specific teaching, but in his demonstration that philosophy isn't just for lecture halls and ivory towers. His life proved that ideas can dance with power, that wisdom can wear worldly clothes, and that one can aim for virtue while acknowledging human frailty. His writings continue to offer what he promised his friend Lucilius: not school lessons, but lessons in how to live. In the end, Seneca achieved something remarkable. He made philosophy useful without making it simple, practical without making it shallow. His legacy reminds us that the great questions he wrestled with, how to live well, die well, use power wisely, and find meaning in an uncertain world, remain as urgent today as they were in ancient Rome. In his struggles and compromises, his triumphs and tragic end, we see not just a historical figure, but a mirror reflecting our own attempts to navigate between ideals and reality, between what we believe and what we must do.